o'clock hour, already midway through it. Matt Fortuna of theathletic.com joins us on Sikkim 365 Radio and 365 Sports. And Matt, of course, just wait a while, and it's crazy. Things will change quite a bit. In your opinion, what is right now the most interesting part of where we are, other than the obvious of what Notre Dame does?
Yeah, I think it's kind of I wouldn't say calmness, but the quiet, the silence we had, and what's been a full week now since the initial news broke that USC and UCLA were going to the Big Ten. I think part of that was the holiday weekend, of course, but much like last year when news broke of Oklahoma and Texas leaving the Big 12 for the SEC, what was breaking loose. Everyone was scrambling around the country. No one knew what this would mean. Obviously, nothing happened I shouldn't say nothing happened. Nothing happened at the Group of Five level as far as defections until this past week with the Pac12 Big Ten shakeup. But I think the silence in some ways is a little bit deafening. I can't figure out, as I'm sure everyone else is trying to figure out, is this because nothing's actually happening, or is this because something really big is about to happen and everyone's keeping their mouth shut because they don't want to spoil it yet?
Matt, Notre Dame has never had to be in a conference other than the 2 years ago when they joined the ACC to get through COVID. They haven't been made to now. No one has tried to make them. None of the other conferences have tried, or if they have, it's not been earth-shattering enough for any of us to really know about it. What would have to happen for the other conferences to demand them to join a conference? Yeah,
I mean, I think if we're going to harp on the word demand, it would be essentially boxing them out from whatever the future championship tournament or system is for college football. And I don't see that happening because, again, this is a program that would bring a massive amount of money to whichever conference it ends up joining. So I don't see an ultimatum, so to speak, coming in that form. I do think the calculus certainly has changed, though, for Notre Dame really in the last week with last week's Big Ten news. I just think, a year ago at this time, I shouldn't even say a year ago at this time, pretty much any time anything ever happens in college football, there's an instant reaction for most people to say, well, does this mean Notre Dame has to join a conference? And my answer has always been no, especially last year. I think when the Big 12 SEC news had happened, we at least at the time were under the impression that there was a 12-team playoff about to be unveiled, 12-team system, and that Jack Swarbrick, Notre Dame's athletic director, was one of four people who had helped implement that system, get it off the ground, with a clause that Notre Dame would be eligible for it. They just wouldn't have a bye if they weren't in a conference. Now we don't know what the playoff's going to be. And now I think our idea of a conference in the strictest definition of the term is not the same as it was last week. It just isn't. The feeling around Notre Dame forever was, why join the Big Ten when we would probably just become another football Midwestern power in a league that already has no shortage of those. The Big Ten's not a Midwestern conference anymore. Last week, it's a national conference. It stretches literally from coast to coast. So I don't think Notre Dame would lose any of its national appeal if it were to join the Big Ten full-time in football. I think you'd be able to fly coast to coast, play a national schedule, much the way you do now. And, oh, by the way, the money. It always comes down to the money, right? I mean, I think Notre Dame has left some money on the table in recent years by not joining a conference, but that was a bridgeable gap. Right now we're talking about, at least $100 million per school per year in the annual payout, I think, with this next Big Ten TV deal coming up versus what Notre Dame's getting from NBC for the next few years, which is believed to be in the $15 to $20 million range. So that's significant money that you're leaving on the table every single year, and that gap will only continue to grow the longer you stay independent. So I do think people at Notre Dame have to take a long, hard look in the mirror right now and ask themselves, is this the path? Do we still want to take the path we've always taken, because things have changed a lot?
Matt, in terms of potentially a third path where there's one, doing what they've always done, two, joining the Big Ten, or three, you've seen, I'm sure, what about Notre Dame and the ACC and what they could put together and the Pac12 alliance and all? Is there anything outside of, let's say, Big Ten or staying independent that you think would be somewhat realistic that Notre Dame would entertain, such as some kind of hookup with the ACC, for example?
Yeah, I have a hard time seeing that happen. Now, look, I understand why people are going that route, because obviously the 1 year they did play in a conference, like you said, was in the ACC in 2020, and they already have all of their Olympic sports in the ACC right now and are legally obligated to play 5 football games against ACC competition, an average of 5 football games against ACC competition every single year. But again, I think if they were to go 2 feet in with the ACC right now, as much as that would help the league financially, get out of their current TV deal and make more money than they are right now, which is not a whole lot. I still think that gap would be so significant between what they could be making in the Big Ten or SEC that it just makes very little sense for Notre Dame to make that move right now to the ACC.
Matt, if you take both the Big Ten and SEC and just put them in a different atmosphere, because we know that's where they are, who's 3, 4, and 5 in the pecking order right now among the Power Fives?
That's the ultimate question, right? I think all 3 of those conferences are trying to stake their claim to that right now, and certainly everything we've gathered out of Big 12 country in what's been essentially a week, I believe exactly a week. It feels like a lot longer ago since Brett Yormark took over or was officially announced as commissioner of the Big 12. He sounds like he's been very proactive, very aggressive. He has gotten those athletic directors pretty fired up in terms of being aggressive and going to, in their mind, hopefully annex some part of Pac-12 country and position that conference to be number 3, the next best, if you will, behind the Big Ten and SEC. Now, look, everyone I've talked to in ACC countries essentially said the same thing, right? They might not be the most financially lucrative, but they are the most stable because they have that grant of rights, which ties everyone in that league full time for the next 14 years right now. So it depends on how you look at it between a financial landscape and between a stability landscape. But it's hard to envision everything staying as it is right now. I mean, I would argue if Oregon and Washington committed to the Pac-12 right now, the Pac-12 with the remaining 10 programs would still have a pretty good chance of being number 3 in that regard as well.
Matt, do you think that Notre Dame has any reason to move with any expediency here, or can they just kind of sit and watch everybody else scramble around and then make their decision?
I think they're going to let this play out. I think the most relevant playbook, if you will, would be to watch what Notre Dame did, or look back and see what Notre Dame did at this time about 10 years ago, right, when the Big East was falling apart. It was unclear what Notre Dame would do as far as would they go to one conference for their Olympic sports for 1 year and then join another conference or join the American Athletic Conference, which didn't even exist at the time. There was a lot up in the air at that time, and they kind of slow played it a little bit. They weren't the first move, they weren't the last move, but they were able to find a profitable home for their Olympic sports and make a reasonable scheduling agreement and concessions with the ACC to get the deal that they currently have with that conference right now. I think the Big Ten, if anything, would want an answer sooner rather than later because they're in the middle of negotiating their media rights deal as we speak. And as we all know, Notre Dame would make that conference a lot richer than it already is. But from my understanding in Big Ten country, they got what they wanted last week as far as growing their value, so to speak, with Fox and with their media partners. UCLA and USC are going to make this conference richer. If Notre Dame comes aboard, all the better because they'll be better competitively and it'll be more lucrative financially. But from my understanding, the Big Ten does not feel like they're under a time crunch here to get Notre Dame in before this next deal gets done. They seem pretty happy with what they're able to pull off last week.
Matt, you've already answered the Notre Dame part, but what are your thoughts on just all the scuttlebutt surrounding the Pac-12 and the various avenues they're exploring to try and figure out how they can stay afloat, in particular whatever kind of partnership with the ACC would be? I mean, there's a lot of talk about what that even would be, right? But what do you think of the Pac-12 and kind of the position they're sitting in at the moment?
Yeah, I understand why the Pac-12 would want that. I understand why they want to be aggressive, why they would want a lot of those games that otherwise don't get viewed by large audiences on that part of the country due to the Pac-12 network, why they'd want ESPN or the ACC network or some ESPN subsidiary to come in and take over that content and broadcast it to a larger reach on the West Coast. Not to mention, again, there's some pretty good football teams in the ACC. There's some pretty valuable brands there, and economically it would make sense. I think a lot of people in ACC country right now, though, are wondering, what's in it for us? Can we guarantee that we'll make more money by doing this? And can we guarantee that we wouldn't be reopening our current deal? We would just be amending it, so to speak. And we're getting really in the weeds here as far as legalese goes, but there's a reason for that. I mean, again, I think a lot of the bigger programs in that conference are looking for any kind of straw they can hang on to right now to possibly find a loophole or an opening to get out of that grant of rights and explore their options with the Big Ten or the SEC. So I think the Pac-12 is being a little bit more aggressive, both publicly and privately, with wanting that kind of merger because they're the ones who need it right now more than the ACC does.
Matt, how does the college football expansion move forward? We know it's been kind of stuck in the mud. It was very close a year ago, and in fact, they got a little bit cocky about it. And then, of course, there was the alliance or whatever the hell that was supposed to be because it's gone. But if they meet, I'm sure, sometime in the next few months. How can they look at expansion when there's a chance that some of these teams or conferences that would be a part of any type of playoff scenario may not be existing?
No, it's a great question. And look, Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, tried to warn us all. I mean, some of it was posturing, but some of it was genuine. I mean, he kept saying, like, don't think just because we're going for 12 right now means we'll go 12 will still be on the table if you say no the first time. I'll never forget being at the national title game or in Indianapolis for the national title game the day some of their playoff meetings had concluded. And Bob Bowlesby and Greg Sankey in particular were very upset with the fact that nothing really got done as far as moving closer toward finalizing a new playoff system. Both vocalized their frustrations. Two of those guys both those guys, I should say, were part of the 4-man working group that helped devise the proposed 12-team playoff field. And I'll never forget, Greg Sankey's talking to a group of us at a round table before the game, and he gets up, and I said, one more question, Commissioner. What's the next step here? What do you do? If you guys can't agree now, what makes you think you'll agree the next time? And he said, the next step for me is to walk across the street to Lucas Oil Stadium and watch 2 really good football teams represent the Southeastern Conference in the national championship game. And that to me was the ultimate, like, you know what? We can do whatever we want because we're the SEC. It's working well for us now. It's going to work well for us in whatever kind of future format we all end up agreeing upon. And if other conferences don't want to join us, well, they're going to be the ones who are out of luck. And, you know, as much as people in ACC country and Pac-12 country might hate to say it or hear it, he's probably right. I mean, there's got to be some seller's remorse right now if you're part of that group of the alliance, excluding the Big Ten, that voted against expanding to 12 because the surest path to relevancy in any sport, in college sports, is essentially access to a championship. And we don't have any idea what that will look like in the future.
Well, Matt, that's why, like, the scenarios they threw out outside of, like, yeah, we got to figure out some TV deals and stuff. Like, I think that not that those are little things, but those are things that would get accelerated and maybe more excited if you knew what it was going to be in the future, as opposed to waiting until the TV deal is done to make or the playoff deal is done to make it right. It feels to me like the Pac-12 and ACC helped the Big Ten do some dirty work, and then the Big Ten used the Pac-12 to get exactly what they wanted, which was Southern California.
Yeah, that's true. And look, I think I can understand, you know, the frustration with the process. I mean, it will go down as one of the all-time PR errors in the history of college athletics for the college football playoff to put out last June. We're publicly recommending a 12-team proposal because what they did was create this expectation that it's going to happen, which I think we all thought at the time. And everyone learned about it the same way me and you did, right? Like the commissioners of the ACC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, they all learned about it this way. And I think there was a sense of like, what are you talking about? Like you guys were in the kitchen the whole time making the meal and telling us this was what we're eating for dinner and we had no say in it. Now, part of it was those 3 commissioners, the alliance or whatever you want to call them, commissioners, they're all within their first or second years on the job and felt excluded from a personal standpoint and you know, felt blindsided from a posturing standpoint. I mean, I think there was a lot of, hey, Greg Sankey and the SEC are trying to take over the entire college athletics world right now. We need to punch back and not roll over. And I think part of it, too, if you're the ACC, again, they're in a really long, not that profitable deal with ESPN right now. If that proposal was to get passed and extend to 12 teams in the next couple of years, ESPN would have played most, if not all, a part in it. And I think if you're the ACC, you're using the only chip you have, which is essentially, hey, you want us to help you, you got to help us first. And I think in the short term right now, it looks like that backfired.
Matt, if you don't mind, a follow-up question. Do you like what's going on? As just a college football?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I look, it's really good for business, so I'd be very condescending or not honest if I said, hey, this is terrible, and then write about it and come on radio shows and talk about it. But look, there's a lot of palace intrigue. It's fun. Like, as a reporter, I like it because it's exciting. As a fan, I think long term there are a lot more questions than there are answers. And I understand the dollar rules everything these days, and you can't ignore that because it's a kill or be killed world in college athletics right now. But I do wonder at some point if it's just the big two, if it's the AFC, NFC, right? You got the it's the NFL, CBS, and Fox with each conference. In college, if it's Fox and ESPN with each conference, at some point, does this just resemble the NFL way too much with the inferior on-field product? And then do we gradually start to lose interest? I don't know. And that's kind of like a doom and gloom scenario as far as how bad it could get. But right now, again, not being in the middle of it and just kind of reporting on it, it is pretty exciting. But I completely understand fans and others who feel otherwise with the way this has gone.
I agree. Matt, thank you for your time. Appreciate it as always. Matt Fortuna, theathletic.com. Many things college football, quite a bit the angles of what's happening as far as his thoughts on also Notre Dame and the Fighting Irish.
Sounds like